The entire human race could once have fit inside a single sports stadium. Not a city, not a country, the whole species, scattered across a hostile, freezing world, perhaps 10,000 people, perhaps fewer. That's not a scene from science fiction, it's a real moment buried in our past. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. It didn't happen once, it happened twice. We almost didn't make it. Let's go back. Somewhere between 900,000 and 800,000 years ago, something happened to our ancestors that came terrifyingly close to ending the entire human story before it really began. When geneticists went looking through the DNA of people alive today, they found a strange scar written into our code, a bottleneck, a moment where the breeding population collapsed to somewhere around 1,280 individuals, and it didn't bounce back quickly. It stayed that low for an astonishing length of time. For roughly 117,000 years, our whole lineage balanced on the very edge of non-existence. Sit with that number for a second. That stretch of time is longer than agriculture, longer than every civilization you've ever heard of, stacked end to end several times over. For all of it, the future of every human who would ever live rested on a group smaller than a modern village, a few thousand people who had no idea that everything depended on them. So what nearly finished us? The leading theory points to climate. Around that time, the planet lurched violently. Ice ages deepened in the north, locking up the world's water and dropping sea levels. Rainfall patterns shifted and broke. And across Africa, the cradle where these early humans lived, vast green stretches baked into desert. Lakes that had fed entire communities shrank to cracked mud. The animals our ancestors hunted thinned out and disappeared. The plants they gathered stopped growing. When the food vanishes, everything that depends on it begins to fall apart. Small, isolated bands of early humans, already fragile, found their world shrinking around them, and eventually they simply ran out of places to run. But here's the eerie part. This wasn't just a hard century or two that our ancestors shrugged off. The genetic evidence suggests we lost a staggering share of our ancestral diversity in this window, possibly more than half of it. Think about what that means. Entire family lines, entire branches of the human tree simply stopped. People who had survived, struggled, raised children of their own, and then their line ended forever. Whoever lived through it became the narrow gate that every single person on Earth today had to pass through. And somehow, against odds that really should have erased us, that tiny population held on. They adapted. They found refuges, pockets of land that still held stable water and food while everything around them collapsed. They clung to those places, and they waited out the worst of it. And slowly, across tens of thousands of years, far longer than all recorded history, their numbers crept back up. Humanity clawed its way back from the brink. You'd assume that's the dramatic climax of the story, the hardest moment, survived. The lesson learned, it isn't. Now jump forward to roughly 70,000 years ago. By then, humanity had spread much further across the world, more confident, more capable, but it was about to run straight into a second near extinction. And this one didn't come from slow, grinding climate change. It came from somewhere far stranger. It came from the sky. On the island of Sumatra, in modern-day Indonesia, a volcano called Mount Toba erupted with a force that is almost impossible to picture. This wasn't an ordinary eruption. It was one of the largest the planet has seen in the last 2 million years. A blast so enormous, it left behind a crater you can still see from space today. And the real danger wasn't the lava, it was what the eruption threw into the atmosphere. Toba hurled enormous volumes of ash and sulfur high into the atmosphere, where they spread around the globe and hung there, blocking out the sun. Scientists call what followed a volcanic winter. For years afterward, sunlight dimmed, temperatures fell, and vegetation withered across whole continents. A gray haze settled over the world, and the warmth that every living thing depended on quietly drained away. Some researchers believe this catastrophe squeezed human populations into yet another brutal bottleneck. Once again, the genetic signal seems to point to a crash, possibly down to just a few thousand breeding individuals worldwide. Two near extinctions, hundreds of thousands of years apart, both leaving their fingerprints pressed into our DNA. Now, to be fair, not everyone agrees on how severe this second one really was. Some scientists argue the genetic signal from Toba is murkier than the first event, and that human groups in parts of Africa and Asia may have weathered the eruption better than we once assumed, sheltered by geography, or simply lucky. The debate is still open, but the broader pattern is hard to deny. More than once, our species flirted with disappearing entirely, and we only get to stand here arguing about the details because somehow, against everything, we didn't. So what actually saved us? It wasn't strength, it wasn't numbers, it was something quieter and far more powerful: flexibility. The early humans who survived these crises weren't the strongest or the most numerous, they were the ones that could change the fastest. When their usual food disappeared, they didn't just starve waiting for it to come back. They shifted their diets, cracking open shellfish along coastlines, digging for roots, hunting whatever they could find. When familiar land turned deadly, they pushed into harsh, marginal places that other species couldn't tolerate: rocky shores, high ground, the edges of the habitable world. And when isolation became a death sentence, they pulled together into tighter, more cooperative groups, sharing food, knowledge, and protection. That adaptability, that stubborn, almost creative refusal to simply die out, is arguably the single trait that defines us more than any other. We weren't given the biggest brains in nature to start with, nor the fastest bodies, nor the claws and strength of a real predator. What we had was something harder to see and much harder to beat: the ability to look at a collapsing world and figure out how to survive just one more season, and then the one after that, and then 1,000 more. Which leaves us with a genuinely unsettling truth. Existence for our species was never guaranteed. It was never inevitable. Every person who has ever lived, every empire that ever rose, every painting, every song, every language, every memory, all of it descends from a population so small, so fragile, that it could have been wiped out on any random week for reasons completely beyond anyone's control. One worse drought, one larger eruption, one unlucky winter too many, and none of it would exist, including you. We like to imagine human history as a steady, unstoppable climb upward, a straight line from cavemen to cities, always rising. But the deeper you look, the less it resembles a smooth rise. It looks more like a long, lucky string of near misses, a species that more than once came within a hair's breadth of vanishing completely, and every single time, somehow, found a way through the gap. So you are not simply descended from survivors, you are descended from the survivors of survivors of survivors, a line of people stretching all the way back through bottlenecks that by every reasonable measure should have erased us completely. Every single one of your ancestors, without a single exception, lived long enough and got lucky enough to pass the story on. We didn't inherit the earth because we were destined to. There was no plan, no promise, no guarantee written anywhere. We inherited it because twice, when the odds said we shouldn't make it, we adapted, we held on, and we did anyway.